In the quaint town of Creekhaven, there stood an old, forgotten house at the edge of the woods. For years, it had been abandoned, its windows boarded up, the roof sagging under the weight of time. The townspeople often whispered about strange occurrences surrounding the house, the occasional flickering light in an empty window, shadowy figures seen through the cracks in the boards. It was a place of legend, and no one dared approach it. Except for one. Marissa, a young woman new to town, had heard the tales but brushed them off as nothing more than local folklore. She was in desperate need of a quiet place to write, to escape the noise of the city, and the old house, despite its condition, was up for rent at an impossibly cheap price. Ignoring the warnings from her new neighbors, she rented the house for the month. The first day she arrived, the air felt heavier, colder. The house groaned as if it were alive, settling into her presence. The floors creaked beneath her feet, and the dim light that filtered through the dusty windows only made the shadows in the corners grow longer. But Marissa was not easily frightened. She set up her typewriter in the front room, determined to make this her creative haven. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor, she began to notice the strange silence that enveloped the house. No distant hum of cars, no chirping crickets, not even the wind seemed to disturb the stillness. That night, as she lay in bed, the silence was broken by the faintest of sounds, whispers, so soft they could have been imagined. At first, Marissa thought it was the wind, the house settling, or even her own tired mind playing tricks on her. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. They came from the walls, a hushed murmur of voices, too indistinct to understand but undeniably present. She tried to ignore them, but every night they returned, relentless and growing in intensity. One evening, frustrated and sleepless, Marissa pressed her ear to the wall. Her breath caught in her throat. The whispers were clearer now, though still too muffled to make out the words. But there was something else, movement. It was faint, like the shuffling of feet or the dragging of something heavy behind the walls. Her pulse quickened as the noise seemed to follow her, moving from one room to the next, always just behind the wall she was nearest to. The following morning, exhausted and on edge, she explored the house more thoroughly. In the basement, beneath a layer of dust and debris, she found a trapdoor. It was old, the wood rotting and swollen, but she managed to pry it open. A narrow set of stone steps descended into darkness. Armed with a flashlight, Marissa descended the steps, her heart racing with each creak of the old stairs. At the bottom was a small room, its walls covered in strange, intricate carvings. Symbols she didn't recognize twisted and spiraled in patterns that made her dizzy if she looked at them for too long. In the center of the room was a large stone slab, and above it, a series of hooks embedded into the ceiling. As she moved closer to inspect the carvings, the whispers returned, louder now, insistent. They filled the room, surrounding her, pressing in on her from all sides. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no one there. Yet the whispers persisted, growing into frantic, panicked voices. She stumbled backward, her hand brushing against the stone slab. And then the voices stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. But it was not the comforting silence of an empty house. This silence was different. It was waiting. A cold breeze swept through the room, and Marissa shivered. She turned to leave but froze when she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway at the top of the stairs. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow. Its eyes, two pinpoints of glowing red, stared down at her. Marissa's flashlight flickered and died. In the pitch darkness, she heard the figure's slow, deliberate steps descending toward her. The whispers began again, now clearer than ever, and she finally understood them. They were pleading, begging for her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the darkness with the thing that lived in the walls. It stopped just inches from her, and she could feel its icy breath on her skin. The whispers reached a fever pitch, screaming in her ears, and then nothing. Marissa awoke in her bed, drenched in sweat. The morning light streamed through the windows, and the house was quiet once more. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, a horrible nightmare. But when she looked at her hands, they were covered in dirt and grime. She had been in that basement, determined to leave the house immediately. She packed her bags and rushed for the front door, but it wouldn't open. None of the windows would budge either. She was trapped. Desperate, Marissa fled to the basement. Perhaps the trapdoor led to a way out. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, the stone slab was gone, replaced by a yawning black pit. And from that pit came the whispers, now louder, echoing from below. She realized with dawning horror that the voices weren't just inside the house. They were calling her name. The figure from before appeared at the edge of the pit, its hand outstretched. "Come," it whispered, its voice now clear, unmistakable. "It's time." When Marissa realized the front door wouldn't open, panic gripped her heart. She twisted the knob with increasing desperation, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short gasps. The door was stubborn, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. She pounded on it, shouting for help, but the house remained eerily quiet. No one heard her. The windows wouldn't budge either. It was as if the house itself had locked her in, trapping her within its decaying walls. The cold sweat of terror trickled down her spine. Her mind raced, searching for explanations. Perhaps it was old wood, swollen with age, or maybe her nerves were frayed from too little sleep. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The whispers, the strange basement, the figure, none of it was a coincidence. The house had been waiting for her. It wanted her. Her stomach churned with nausea as the whispers began again, low and insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. They came from all around her now, filling the space with a suffocating pressure. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering in her chest, and the cold, oppressive air of the house seemed to close in on her. That's when she saw it again. Standing at the top of the staircase was the creature. Its tall, gaunt frame seemed impossibly still, like a statue carved from shadow. The dim light from the failing afternoon sun barely illuminated it, but those eyes, two glowing red pinpoints in the darkness, were unmistakable. They locked onto her with an unsettling intensity, and in that moment, Marissa felt a primal fear, something deep and instinctual that told her this thing was not of this world. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her throat tightened as if the very air in the room had turned solid, choking her. The creature began to move, slowly, deliberately, down the stairs. Each step it took was accompanied by a low, creaking groan from the old wood, as though the house itself was aware of the thing walking through it. Marissa's limbs felt like lead, heavy and useless. She wanted to run, to hide, but her body refused to move. Her legs trembled, but they wouldn't respond. The whispers grew louder, swelling into a cacophony of overlapping voices, their urgency now unmistakable. They were pleading with her, "Run! Run!" But her feet remained rooted to the floor. The creature reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, standing just a few feet from her. The air between them felt thick with dread, every inch of her body screaming in terror. She could feel the cold radiating from it, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Its face was still hidden in shadow, but the faint outline of its lips, thin, pale, and cracked, twitched into something like a smile. "Come." The whisper was no longer coming from the walls. It was coming from it. Her heart skipped a beat. The creature extended one skeletal hand, long fingers curling toward her, and Marissa's blood ran cold. She stepped back instinctively, her body finally responding, but there was nowhere to go. Every door, every window was sealed. She was trapped with this thing that wanted her. Marissa felt the world closing in around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tightening as though invisible hands were squeezing the life out of her. The walls seemed to pulse, the very house alive with anticipation, feeding on her fear. Every inch of her screamed to run, to escape, but the creature's glowing red eyes held her captive, frozen in place. She was losing control. The house was swallowing her. As she took her first step into the darkness, the house groaned one last time, its ancient walls sighing with satisfaction. The whispers faded, and the house returned to its quiet, waiting for the next tenant to arrive. But Marissa would never leave. She was part of the house now. Forever.